The history of witches and Dungeons and Dragons is as old as the game itself. We're going to talk about some of the different versions of the witch that have appeared throughout the history of the game today on Daddy Roll the One. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin, and this is another video in my series on the history of tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons and Dragons. I'm also going to add this to my playlist on D&D classes. So if you're interested in a deep dive on the various classes in D&D, where, when, and why, and by whom they were created, then you'll want to check out that playlist. And if that kind of history is interesting to you, then please make sure to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and hit the notification button to be notified when I drop a new video. And if you could please share the video with your friends, I would really appreciate it. The YouTube algorithm really appreciates when people share from YouTube. So there's a share button right under the video description on your screen. And if you hit that share button, get the link, and then share it on your social media, that for some reason does a better job in the algorithm than if you just copy the video link here and then share it on Facebook or wherever. All right, so I wanted to talk about witches today, and this was a topic that was actually suggested by one of my viewers in the comments of my last video. So I did a video last week on the complete book of necromancers for 2nd edition, kind of as a gearing up toward the Halloween season, if people wanted to perhaps run a Halloween-themed game or session. And one of the viewers, and his name is Richard. I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name. Seckmisters. I really apologize for butchering that name. But Richard asked if I could do a video talking about the witch class in Dragon Magazine. And I thought, hey, that's a great idea. Again, it's thematically appropriate for the season. Today is Monday, October 7th. So you still have a few weeks to get a game ready if you want a Halloween-themed type session for your fantasy adventure games. And so I thought, okay, let's look at that. But it's a little bit more complicated than just looking at the witch from Dragon Magazine, because in fact, there have been several different versions of the witch published in Dragon Magazine up through, 1st edition, at least 4 that I'm aware of off the top of my head. And so I thought it would help to, again, talk about a little bit of history of where the class came from and how it's evolved and developed over time. So the video is going to cover the witch class as it has appeared multiple times in Dragon Magazine. I'm also going to focus on 2 things particular as we get into the middle of the video after we get past that initial history, which is going to be the witch class from this issue. This is Dragon issue number 114. This is the one I think most people think of when they think of the witch in D&D. In fact, you see it says here, the return of the witch, and that's going to be important for later. So we're going to talk about that one quite a bit more, I guess, than some of the other ones. And then the other one I wanted to spend a little time on is this one from the Principalities of Glantri. So this was technically, a quote-unquote official class published by the folks at TSR for use by players, which is important because the witches in Dragon Magazine are all intended to be non-player characters. So this is for the BECME edition of the game, or Rules Cyclopedia, whatever you want to call that, edition from the first debuted in 1983 and then continued on. This is from, I think, 1987, perhaps. Yep, got it right. So one of my favorites, gazetteers, the Principalities of Glantri. And there, like I said, there's a witch tradition in here for magic users. So I'm going to spend time on that. And then toward the end of the video, very, very, very briefly, I'm going to go over some ideas on how witches have appeared post Wizards of the Coast. So with 3rd edition onward, again, it's going to be very, very brief. The focus is going to be on, TSR era witches. And then I'm also at the end of the video, after that brief discussion on, 3rd edition and onward, I'm going to talk about some third-party supplements that were created, some of them dating all the way back to the 70s, that were created to be compatible with Dungeons and Dragons that did talk about witches. So that's going to be the focus for today. But let's start out and look at the original game, original Dungeons and Dragons, 1974. And of course, if you're familiar with this, you know that there are no witches in here. And even the level titles for magic users that are in here do not mention witch. It does mention warlock as a level title. And a lot of people will sometimes equate witches and warlocks, and they'll say, oh, well, witch is the female term and warlock is the male term. This one doesn't mention that at all. But there's a picture in here. That's what I wanted to point out. And I have shown this picture before, but it specifically has a picture here of a beautiful witch and then an Amazon. So they were thinking about witches, okay, thinking about them all the way back in this particular publication, 1974, Dungeons and Dragons. Now, one thing else I want to show you while I'm here, and I'm not going to necessarily go through these in order of publication because I'm going to be going back and forth between stuff that I actually own as print copies and stuff that I have as PDFs. And so I'm going to be moving back from my credenza here over to my laptop and looking at things there and then kind of coming back and forth. And so I thought it would kind of make sense to kind of paint a picture of things like, consistently rather than me going back and forth. So I did want to talk about a couple of other times witches were mentioned in official publications before we go over to Dragon issue number 5, which is the first one I'm going to deal with on my laptop. But this is the Holmes Basic Edition of Dungeons and Dragons, published in 1977. And so this was intended to basically rewrite the rules rewrite all of this, like including the supplements, the 3 books from here and most of the supplements, although it really mostly just takes stuff from Greyhawk. Which was supplement 1, and condense it into a format that was easily understandable and digestible for younger players. So this one specifically doesn't give you an age, but it was intended to be used by people who were not familiar with some of the terminology and wargaming mechanics and things, where this is written assuming that you kind of already have a familiarity with what some of these terms are. And so it doesn't always define them, it just uses them. And there's little context for people who didn't have that background to know what they were talking about. So anyway, that's what this was written. So this is 1977, and it's written in the same year that the first book in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which is the Monster Manual, is going to be published. So when this was being worked on, edited by Eric J. Holmes, it was known that Advanced Dungeons and Dragons was coming out soon. And so while this is a distillation and again intended to concisely rewrite these rules, it does change the rules. And it's kind of this weird thing where it is compatible with this. So 100% it's compatible with this, but it was also intended to later on be compatible with Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Now that's going to change, and they're going to decide that this is kind of its own thing. So this only covers levels 1 through 3, and it's never going to get any other supplements or additions or anything to this. This is written, and it tells you that if you want to go beyond level 3, you should refer to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. But then they're going to come up with a new basic set in 1981, which kind of changes the dynamic of these two systems, like what we call basic Dungeons and Dragons and Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. But you see right here where it says additional character classes, and it says there are a number of other character types which are detailed in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. There are subclasses of the 4 basic classes. They are paladins and rangers for fighting men, or fighters now we would call them, illusionists and witches, magic users, monks and druids for clerics, and assassins for thieves. Now it says witches here. This is the only subclass out of this whole list that is not going to appear in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So clearly they were thinking about it. I'm not sure if Gary Gygax told Eric Holmes to put witches in here, or if Eric just assumed that they were going to be. Whatever the case may be, that didn't get, I don't want to say it didn't get caught, because it was probably intended at the time. But in any way, those are never going to appear. But they were thinking about it. Okay. Now I'm going to jump all the way here to 1980. This is Deities and Demigods. And this isn't really a class so much, but in the Nebwan mythos for the Fafhrd and Green Mouser stories from Fritz Leiber, there's a little section here on snow witches. And it says, many of the northern tribes have a group of women that have a measure of magical power. These women, after some preparation and working together, can control all forms of cold and ice spells. They also possess amongst the strongest members a limited telepathy when in direct eye contact with a human. Given a group of 5 women in 24 hours time, limited weather control, and it says in parentheses, chilling is possible. This effect has a range of 5 miles. So that's important because it's starting to kind of, I guess, presage the idea of like you're going to see in other versions of a witch class, like a coven. So again, groups of women, groups of witches. It says, a group of 5 women. So the idea that witches in combination with each other in a circle or a coven or whatever you want to call it can perform rituals and do things that are, beyond the scope of like a single individual magic user. So those are some ideas that's just written in there. It's just a throwaway line almost, because there's no details in that, and there's no mechanics. There's no like stat block for a snow witch. There's nothing like that in this book. But the thought was already there that this idea again of witches working together in a coven, like I said, or a circle. So that's kind of some early information that we can look at. And what I want to do now is go to the Dragon Magazine versions of the witch. So there are going to be 3 of them that are going to pop up in here. And it's Dragon Magazine's issue number 5, issue number 20, and issue number 43. And after we go through those, I'm going to come back here and then we're going to spend time with this one, the one from number 114. Okay, so that's going to be the focus after we get back from the laptop. Okay, so we're at my laptop now, and we're going to start looking at these 3 issues of Dragon Magazine, issue number 5, 20, and 43. So what's interesting we're going to find is that over time, of course, our views on how witches are going to be depicted in Dungeons and Dragons and other, third-party companies that are creating content for the game, they're changing as more is learned and known about that. So I think the original witches, what I've seen is that they kind of adhere more to like that very specific sort of, like a Wizard of Oz type of situation where you've got, the Wicked Witch of the West and the Good Witch of the North and that kind of thing. There's very much like that aesthetic put onto like these early types of witches. It's very much coming from fiction, and also a little bit of, that like the Salem witch trials, this type of thing. But over time, as people get access to more information and knowledge and scholarly works and things like that about the history of witches and witchcraft, there's a change in the way that they're promoted and described in the works, where they start to become much more associated, I'd say, with nature and things like that, as opposed to being like, evil female spellcasters, which is a lot of times how they're first described. So let's dive into Dragon Magazine number 5. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I've already covered this in a video in my series where I'm covering the history of Dragon Magazine, essentially issue by issue. I usually do like 2 to 3 issues in a video. And I did have a video covering Dragon Magazine number 5. So if you've seen a thumbnail where it says like Gandalf is a 5th level wizard, that comes from this article right here. And I used that title because I knew people would click on it. But I do cover quite a bit of the witch in there. So in this particular issue, the witch is presented as it's called a witchcraft supplement. So it's not really a class. It's not even a non-player character class. It's sort of just talking about the traditions of witchcraft and how their magic works, and then creating spell lists for them. And now one of the interesting things about this is that, and it's kind of sad, I've been doing some research on this, but they received the manuscript. The folks at Dragon Magazine, the editors, received the manuscript, and it was not signed. It was anonymous, and they got it about more than a year before they actually published it. And they said they were looking for the person who wrote it, and they never heard back. And as far as I can tell, that authors have never been found. But this is really in a D&D publication, March of 77, or, a TSR publication, because it was published by TSR at the time, or TSR periodicals, but it was all part of the same company. This really starts to set the stage for a lot of the future articles that we're going to see on witches. So again, it talks about like secret order witches, and that like witches are either lawful 35% of the time or chaotic 65% of the time. And, again, it has like, it's breaking them into different orders. And and talking about, again, the type of magic that they're going to use. So it says witchcraft, including those spells which resemble clerical or wizard spells, don't affect genes, Ifrit, or clerics of any alignment. Those three types it says character types, which is funny because you wouldn't think of Jinn and Ifrit being characters, are immune to witchcraft. And then it says, they use saving throws equal to warlocks, which I guess in this particular case, they mean magic users. That's not a term that would normally be defined other than being a specific level title for a magic user. I think it's eighth level. Okay. But anyway, again, watch my video on the History of Dragon Magazine issue number 5, because I'm going to cover this particular article in a lot more detail. And it is very detailed. I mean, you can see here, it just keeps kind of going on and on. We're already at like 5 pages, I think, not including this ad here. And then we're going to skip over to page 28. And it finishes up just here, right here, but it's already talking about covens and things like that. Okay, so that's Dragon Magazine issue number 5. Now let's go to issue number 20. This is one of their first fall-themed issues, so it's got this great cover here that I really like. This poor woman's like screaming over here, and this carriage is being driven by a skeletal type figure, and there's ghosts flying all over the place. So I quite like that. But let's go to the article on witches. Now, it's labeled as a D&D variant. Okay, now this is by Ronald Pear, and I'm just checking my notes here. So Ronald wrote a variety of articles in Dragon Magazine, but also Alarms and Excursions, I think Space Gamer, if I remember correctly, and then also did some work on the Fantasy Trip. So sometimes reviews, but also content. So one of his, I would say, more famous, if you want to call it that, articles was called Keeping the Magic User in His Place. And it was a piece of advice for dungeon masters to help them learn how to control a player who's really figured out how to maximize. It's almost like an early form of min-maxing, how to maximize the effectiveness of their magic user characters to where they're like taking over the game. And the article's written to help dungeon masters figure out a way to rein that in a little bit so that that character doesn't run away with the game, that one player, and like where all the other players feel like they're useless. So again, I think it's probably his most famous article. It's a pretty popular article that at the time, and one that people look back on even today. So, but as you get into this article, it says another look at witches and witchcraft in D&D. So they're acknowledging that they've already looked at it. And then the editor's note, this is going to be from Tim Kask. And it says, this seems to be a well thought out class variant. At the very least, it makes an excellent NPC or hireling acquaintance. For those DMs bold enough to try it, it provides a very viable character for ladies, be they sisters, girlfriends, lady gamers, or others. D&D was one of the first games to appeal to females, and I, for one, find it a better game because of that fact. So, very much written in the time period as to what it is. But it is true that when you look at Dungeons and Dragons, if you consider its wargaming roots, it was one of the first games of that genre that was going to have a broader appeal than just males interested in military history. Not that women can't be interested in that, but it was not as common back then as it would be today. So, but anyway, it talks about back in Dragon Volume 1, number 5, there was an article on witchcraft by players. Witches are grouped into 3 classes of power: for evil witches, low, high, and secret, and 2 into classes for good, white, and priestess. So it says they're well thought out, could provide a challenge on these players encountering them, but they're fast enough that they would make a dandy player class. So this is basically taken that idea where it was written in a way that witches would sort of be like a monster that you would encounter. And that article number 5 even talked about where to put them on the random encounter tables, because, you have to insert them on the tables because they're not there already, so that you knew when you rolled certain numbers, like, oh, that means a witch is going to show up instead of something else. But this is written very specifically to be a character class, and very specifically, they call it a non-player character class. But this class, it's written for so this is the time period of this is, I think it was November of 1978. Yes. So advanced D&D is very, very early just coming out. when this article is written, it's very possible that the player's handbook hadn't been out yet. It's probably, it's been published by this point, but when the article was written, they probably didn't have like eyes on that and to be able to see that article. So it's kind of in this, again, weird time period where this probably fits more into like an original Dungeons and Dragons version of the class versus AD&D, but it kind of like skirts the line in between the two. But it's a little fiddly. So if you see down here, they get powers at every level of the class. And that's not something that was normal with original Dungeons and Dragons or advanced Dungeons and Dragons, having level-based powers at every single level. So it starts to make the class a little bit complex, a little bit difficult to kind of manage. But that's not a bad thing. It's a little bit more time consuming than like, say, playing a fighter or something like that. So because of all these like level based types of things. And those are the types of abilities that can start to unbalance a class when you don't really think through how you're going to mix them together, those abilities with the spells that this class has access to. But it is, really interesting. And it starts to it has that very witch feel, like brewing potions and poisons and narcotics and brewing love potions, and they're adding bonuses to their charisma score as they go up in level. At 9th level, they're going to get a familiar. You see that down here. And then you see their spells and spells per level over here. All right. So this one goes all the way up to, I think it's 16th level. I didn't count what it was, but they get an 8th level spell. The first one that they get is all the way here at the end. And then the level titles are, very specific to sort of like, they're consistent with the idea that the witch is someone who's out to manipulate people and charm them and probably is slightly evil. Okay. So like, Siren and Enchantress Sybil. Okay. Some of them are pretty, neutral in tone. Soothsayer, Mystic, Oracle, those, Sorceress. And then you have these interesting, like, like a gem style witch titles: Amethyst, Topaz, Sapphire, Ruby, Emerald, Diamond, Crystal. And then there's Eternal, and then Demonette is the last level title there. So here's all the different spells that they have. And then you have the explanation of the spells. So, all the new spells that are in here and how do they work. So there's some interesting ones: create lycanthropes, give or cure serious wounds, charm animals, nothing that's really like jumping out at you like that's all that earth shattering. But it's interesting that it's well done in terms of being one of the first classes as an actual class. And then they have their abilities. Again, we talked about brewing poisons and stuff. The love potion, which is just kind of interesting. The victim's not charmed. The potion acts similar to the rod of beguiling. And then it talks about the dance of seduction. Sorry for tripping over that. So suggestive movements of her body, the witch can hold the victim in trance. So this sounds very similar to like stuff that bards do in, like, say, 3rd edition, where they can play and hold people captive, hold their attention captive. I mean, you're seeing that all the way back here in 1978, that kind of idea. Truth drugs, reading scrolls, candle magic, which is very interesting. They manufacture 1 candle per month, and each color is gained with subsequent levels. So the candles get better and better as they go on. But if you burn a red candle in the presence of a victim, it affects him for 1 day per turn of the candle burnt as fully successful love potion with no save. And then blue is protection from evil, and yellow is you get telepathy. There's all these different kinds of things that they get with their candles. So then it's continued. It says down here on page 19. So again, this is a pretty long and detailed class. And when you consider, if you have seen the original versions of classes from original Dungeons and Dragons, or even some of the write-ups from the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Player's Handbook from 1978, they're much shorter than this. This one's pretty lengthy. So, but it's just talking about over here, they can disguise as an assassin. So manufacture acid, voice, transfer hit points, enchant item. Okay, so that is the witch from Dragon Magazine number 20. Now, what's really interesting about this is, again, this is based on that article from number 5, Dragon Magazine number 5, but this is directly going to impact pretty much the other two witches that we're going to see coming up in Dragon Magazine number 43 and in Dragon Magazine number 114. So let's go here. Dragon number 43. And this is from, I think, October of 1980. It might be November. But you've got, this witch right here on the cover. Just kind of fun. It's kind of a fun cover. So let's just check and see. Yeah, it's November of 1980. Okay. So brewing up a new NPC, the witch. All right, now the editor's note here, this is also by Tim Kask. He's still the editor at this point. And he says, in the last 2 years, Dragon Magazine has gained thousands of loyal readers. Many of those readers, as well as some who may have been with us for even longer than that, have asked for a rendition of the witch as a character class for D&D or AD&D. Since it's been 2 years since an article of this sort appeared in Dragon, and since the last witch article was in issue number 20, which is now out of print, we've decided to present a new version of the class as a non-player character which DMs can incorporate into their campaigns. Author Bill Mulhausen is responsible for the original manuscript from which this article evolved, and he drew upon many of the witch characteristics outlined in Dragon's previous articles on the subject, and then added several original touches and sent it in for their examination. And then assistant editor Kim Mohan edited the manuscript for clarity and completeness. And then Tom Moldvay, who was in the design department at TSR at the time, Moldvay of the famous, Moldvay Basic Dungeons and Dragons set, they consider him an authority on the subject of witches and witchcraft from a historical standpoint. And so he added a bunch of suggestions, which they put in here. So it said that it should be reemphasized that the witch presented here is designed to be used as a non-player character or participant in an adventure who is played by the DM according to his or her preferences, the needs of the particular adventure or campaign, or the requirements of a particular set of circumstances. It is not recommended that the information be used to run a player character, although, of course, that could be done. So very consistent at the time. So if you're not familiar with what's happening here, basically the only official character classes that are going to appear in Dragon Magazine during this time period are ones that are going to be written by Gary Gygax for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Everything else was labeled as being a non-player character class because Gary, in his mind, he was the one that was controlling the game balance and he knew how things worked and didn't. And other people just didn't have that knowledge because he didn't always share it with people. So the thought is these are experiments, but they know that people are going to play them. They just had to label them from a marketing standpoint as non-player characters. So it's really goofy, but that's kind of what's happening during this time period. So it says Dragon's responsibility, as we see it, is not to set forth major rules changes or additions to the already complex D&D and AD&D game system, but rather suggest supplements to the game which can be used to add diversity, interest, and excitement to the existing campaign. Okay, so that's the introduction for this revised witch class from Dragon number 43. Okay, now, again, this is by Bill Mulhausen, and I haven't actually been able to find anything else that Bill wrote in the role-playing game industry or community. So I did a little bit of digging, but like I said, I couldn't find anything. So if anybody knows anything else about Bill, this and one other article, which we're going to visit in a second, are the only two things that I could find, again, that Bill wrote. So this is really, again, really based on what we saw in Dragon Magazine number 20. So he starts out and says there's 2 order of witches, low order witches who can progress to level 16, and high secret order witches who can advance to level 22. And it says that they can be of any alignment, and they have prime requisites of intelligence and wisdom, have to be 15 or higher, and their abilities are generated randomly. So meaning their ability scores, right? So, and then to use one of the 4 methods described in the Dungeon Master's Guide. So at this point, this is very clearly for first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So it says only humans and elves can be witches, and only humans can be members of the high secret order. Elves are limited to no higher than 9th level as witches. And it says that elven witches may be multi-classed characters. So, and then it goes on to talk about, their hit dice and all that kind of standard stuff. So they're very much like akin to magic users. So D4 hit dice. And it talks about bonus spells for their ability scores if they have a high intelligence. And then followers, hirelings, and apprentices. When a witch reaches 9th level, she automatically attracts 20 to 200 followers if they establish a place of worship. So this is really going more towards the sort of religious or spiritual aspects of a witch, again, as opposed to sort of like, evil arcane magic, even though, the picture here looks very much like, like I said, the Wicked Witch of the West from Wizard of Oz. So, and then they can have as many as 3 apprentices in training at one time. So I took some of the ideas from this article in the game that I run for my daughter and her friends. And, I also took it from Dungeon Craft, Professor Dungeon Master's channel. But the idea of like, my daughter and one of her best friend, they're playing elves in the game. And I decided that they needed to have training in order to raise in level and learn new spells, and they're being trained by a witch who they've only seen once, and they spent the whole game thinking that the witch looked like this because they never saw her. She only spoke telepathically in their head. She was high up in a tower, and when they finally saw her, I used like a classic painting by Clyde Caldwell and said like, she looks like this, and they were so blown away. They're like, what? And they'll put the picture up here so you can see what I'm talking about. But anyway, so talking about apprentices, so in their game, I consider them apprentices of this NPC witch, and that's how they learn to cast magic and do things like that. So it just goes on to talk about that, and then you get the High Secret Order of Witches. Upon reaching level 10, a witch must decide whether or not to apply for membership in the High Secret Order. Application being only be made by witches with at least 16 intelligence and wisdom, and they have to possess at least one of the following objects: a magic crystal ball, magic broom, mirror of mental prowess, a mirror of life trapping, or on and on, right? All the different things that you could have in order to qualify. So in addition to, the spells acquired normally, they get one additional High Secret Order spell for each level they gained while they are in the High Secret Order. So that's kind of the benefit that you get from doing that. And then it talks about the weapons and armor they can use, and then their inherent abilities. And then if you look at these again, it's what you've seen before. So brew poisons and narcotics, brew tooth drugs, brew love potions, read magic user, druid, and cleric scrolls. There's that candle magic section again. Brew flying ointment, manufacture a control doll, which is kind of fun, and then fascinate. So, but if you look over here, now you'll see that the level titles are very, very similar to what we saw before. You don't have Demoness anymore. You have Queen of Witches at level 22, and Princess of Witches, this kind of thing. But, very similar. It's obviously inspired by that other article. However, you'll see that the inherent abilities that are gained, you don't get them at every level now. They're kind of spaced out a little bit. So that's a bit of a change. And it's, again, to make it, I think, a little bit more playable as a player character type of class. Now, we talked about Tom Moldvay being sort of the expert, I guess they considered him, on historical witches and witchcraft. And so he writes a little article here about the word witch and the several meanings that it has. He talks about the etymology of where it comes from in Old English, and then the kind of knowledge that they would have had through drawing magical symbols and through the use of the Germanic runes or the Celtic Ogam, I think it's called. Anyway, but he just talks about that historical stuff. This is really great. It's short and sweet, but especially at the time when you didn't have access to the internet, or maybe you weren't lucky enough to have encyclopedias and things at home, if they would have even talked about this. So having something like this in Dragon Magazine to help you ground your witch and give it more of a background, so you kind of know how to role play it better. This was a great short little article that I know people still refer back to this day. So I do want to give quick thanks to 2 different blogs that I looked at that I helped get some ideas for this. So one is called Mad Gaming Madness, and the author of that wrote a whole series of articles on witches throughout history, and I was able to fill in some gaps. So I had a lot of it already, but or just gave me ideas of different things to cover. So definitely thanks to Mad Gaming Madness. And then also Tim Brannan is a blog that I've been following since I started blogging, or even slightly before, way back in like 2010, 2011. Tim was one of the first people to follow my blog when I started it. And he is sort of known in the community as being like the witch guy for role-playing games. So he's written several different supplements, almost all of which are about witches. He's created witch classes for different retro clones like Swords and Wizardry, or that kind of thing. I think he's got one for Old School Essentials, and then he also does witches for different role-playing games that aren't D&D related. So definitely, if you're interested in witches in Dungeons and Dragons, check out Tim's blog and then some of the stuff that he has for sale, new spells and classes and things like that. Way back in the 90s, he wrote a book called The Complete Netbook of Witches. And so netbooks were kind of a thing that the fan community was creating at that time that kind of emulated the complete handbooks. I just did a whole series on the complete handbooks from second edition, and he wrote one on witches. And it was quite popular, and I think it's still up and available. And if it is, I'll put a link in the show notes. But Tim was mentioning that he even likes to go back and revisit this article by Tom Mulvey from time to time. Okay, so here we have an explanation of all the different spells and then the different abilities that are gained. So we're going to turn over to page 62 to finish this article up. Okay, so you see the witch spells here that are being explained, and all the different spells by level, and then these high secret order of spells, which are on top of all of these ones over here, okay? And then it talks about alignment restrictions. Several witch spells are described as being usable by witches of certain alignments. In many other cases, the use of spell may be contradicted by the nature of the spells, regards to the alignment, okay, blah, 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 right? And then material components, DM discretion, and it says, as is usually the case with unofficial variants of this nature, the discretion of the DM is to be used in all cases where description or explanation may seem vague or incomplete. The strictures set forth here are intended only as guidelines, and each DM should feel free to change any particular aspect of a spell or any other part of the witch description, just preference and or needs of the individual in his or her campaign. So... and then it just goes on to explain all this. So again, very long. It's a very long class, and part of the reason of that is because it's having to explain all these different spell descriptions and how they're the same or different from the ones that you've already seen. So keeps going on and on and on. And that's going to be it. So it's going to end over here with identical to the first level magic user spell of the same name. Okay, so that's the witch from Dragon Magazine, issue number 43 from November of 1980. I know I went through that pretty fast, but there's a reason for that, and it's because this class is going to be revised yet again for Dragon Magazine, issue number 114, and it's going to be revised by the same person who wrote this one. So it is by Bill Mulhausen, I think was his name, and we're going to go look at that one. And I have that issue, actually have a physical copy of that. So we're going to go visit that in just a second. Okay, so Dragon Magazine number 114. You can see the price has gone up to $350. It's a little difficult to see there with this light type on the moon. But this is a painting on the cover by the artist named David Martin. And this was a very, very controversial cover after they published it. So it's very thematically appropriate for this issue, which is sort of like a Halloween themed issue again. But a lot of people wrote in to letters to the editor in, subsequent issues to complain about this figure here, because she's very clearly, you can see a lot more of her, of her body here with just very sheer, I don't know, cloak or gown or whatever that she has on. And a lot of people really didn't like that. Like I said, they got a lot of complaints later on. So I just kind of wanted to mention that since we have it out. But we're going to look here at The Witch. And again, you see it's by Bill Mulhausen. From Out of the Past, a Scary NPC, updated and redesigned. And then just really quick. So when I pulled this out of my my storage, and when I was looking at see what page the article is on, I just saw this right here, and I just thought you guys would think this is funny. So this is, second edition has not come out yet. This is from October of 1986. So second edition is 3 years away. And it says, Dear Dragon, I am deeply concerned about the future of the AD&D game. What about those of us who have spent $100 plus to get where we are with the first edition? Will they mesh together? I mean, will I be able to use the new DM's guide with the old player's manual? If not, what can a devout first editioner do? Will you have a way for us to trade our old books in for credit? Will you continue to publish first edition books or supplements? So I just thought it was funny that, you've spent $100 and, which I get it. It was a lot of money. It's still a lot of money. But, people now spending, thousands of dollars on this stuff. And I mean, that's what happened with third edition with me, which is part of the reason I didn't switch to fourth. Okay. So just, showing you that people have been complaining about this stuff that's, this is 1986. So that's almost 40 years ago at this point. Okay, so here's the witch. Now, we've got some artwork here by Larry Elmore. So he was relatively new to TSR at the time. I mean, he'd been around for a few years, but he's kind of that crop of newer artists. You're moving away from Sutherland and Trampier and Willingham and getting into the new crop of, Caldwell and Easley and Parkinson and Elmore. Okay, so the witch revised and expanded NPC class by Bill Mulhausen. And then it says, the witch has long been a popular non-player character in the D&D and AD&D games, and longtime readers of Dragon magazine may recall numerous incarnations of this character class and its powers over the years. The most recently published version of the witch appeared in Dragon issue number 43 in November of 1980. Bill Mulhausen's article was revised and edited by Kim Mohan, and Tom Mulvey. This version has been further expanded and revised by Roger E. Moore and edited by Karen Martin, Robin Jenkins, and once again, Kim Mohan. It must be noted that the witch is a very powerful spellcaster. It could conceivably be used as a player character on an experimental basis, but it works best as an NPC used to challenge parties of adventurers on a long-term basis. The class has deliberately been given extraordinary spellcasting powers in terms of numbers of spells available and the power of individual spells. Player character witches may prove to be overwhelming, but NPC witches are thus better able to challenge large groups of adventurers. The decidedly evil nature of the witch, as a rule, is also a point against its use as a player character class. We hope you enjoy it. Happy Halloween, the editors. Okay, so then it's just going on to explain the witch is a special type of powerful spellcaster. It's like this very long introduction, okay, which was very consistent with the way articles were written in Dragon magazine during this time. They gain new spells by performing ritual sacrifice and prayer to deities, usually demon princes, archdevils, or the current Oinodemon. If the deity is pleased, it sends a servant being to teach the witch a new spell appropriate to her level and ability. Because the witch must learn the new spells a magic user does, her chance to know each listed spell and her minimum and maximum number of spells per level are taken from Table 2 on page 10 of the player's handbook. Witches always gain spells, read magic, and write, not having to check for knowing these spells as they start in their class. And then it just kind of goes on. I'm not going to present the whole class here. That's not my intent. I'm mostly just talking about the history of these things. But it talks about, how you can decide how the spells are delivered if you want more variety. And it references Unearthed Arcana here, recovery of spells. And then it goes on to just, it just keeps going on. It talks about those two orders of witches, the low order and the high secret order. Okay, and it's the same thing. Low can progress to 16th level, high to 26, can be of any alignment, though evil witches are the rule. Good and neutral are almost unknown. Has prime requisites, but they've changed them a little bit. They're a little bit lower. It also now allows half-elves to be witches, as opposed to just straight elves and humans. Now half-elves can be. And then it gives your level limits for elves and half-elves that are limited to 11th levels, witches, except for drow, I think, can go higher. And you can't be multi-classed or double-class due to difficulties involved in learning and maintaining one's magical powers. And then it goes on to talk about most witches are female, but there are male witches. But for the most part, they're female because, and it says, the situation is encouraged by the large number of evil male beings ruling in the lower planes who might desire a mortal consort, and by female deities of any alignment governing magic who find worshippers among women in oppressive male-dominated societies. So this is very much cliche kind of stuff right here. And then same hit dice we've talked about before. And so, I mean, you see the presentation of this kind of stuff, and it's, new layout is so much easier to find exactly what you're looking for. To like the hit die that you use, it's just buried in a paragraph here in a wall of text. So, but that's just how they used to write things back then. So it talks about the bonus spells that you can get here. And then with the variable money that you start out with. Okay. And again, this is a pretty long class. So then it talks about followers, hirelings, and apprentices, same kind of order that we saw in that article in Dragon number 43. And then it talks about, how many they're going to get. Now he changes it. So instead of 20 to 200 followers, it's now 5 to 50 that they get. So it's a little bit more reasonable. 200 is kind of ridiculous. So that was cleaned up a little bit. And then it just keeps going on and on about all of that. Okay, and then you have your witch's special abilities, brew poisons and narcotics. So again, all the way back to Dragon number 20, which is where that first appeared by a completely different author. And then this author picked it up in Dragon number 43 and then carried it forward all the way here to Dragon number 114. So this is now October of 1986. It's about 8 years after that first article on witches was published back in November. I think it was November of 1978. That first one that was written, issue number 20. Okay. So then you've got brew love potion, and you've got manufacture poisons and scrolls, candle magic still with us. Okay. So all those types of things. You've got some more art here by Larry Elmore. He has a very distinctive style. I actually kind of tend to prefer his black and white art like this versus his. I love his paintings. There's nothing wrong with his paintings, but I kind of feel like sometimes his black and white work has a little bit more, I don't know, emotion to it. I'm not quite sure how to put that. But again, nothing against his painted work. Now we've got our level titles here. Here's your experience point table. And you've got your level titles, which again, he's picked up pretty much from what we've seen before. You've still got those gem witches, topaz, sapphire, ruby, emerald, diamond. He's changed them a little bit. You've got priestesses and high priestesses and eternal priestesses. But again, you've got queen of witches as the top level title. And then you have your special abilities gained. And, it says none, but again, it's not every level. So you're having gap levels where you don't get a special ability, very much like what he did in Dragon number 43. So this is essentially just kind of like a cleaned up, and slightly revised version of what we've seen before. Then you're going to get into your spell lists again. Okay. And then he's going to get into, there's your high secret order spells. It's very similar to what we already saw. Okay, and then your spell descriptions. And again, this is going to start taking up a lot of real estate in the magazine. So a 2-page spread with all text, just spell explanations. A little bit more art there. Okay, so that's essentially going to be it. It ends with Wind Walk, which is a 7th level cleric spell. So that is probably the most complete version of an Advanced Dungeons and Dragons witch that was written for first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons if you wanted to try to play it as a player character. So if you're playing that version of the game, or maybe you're playing a retro clone like Osric as an example, this one would probably work in there just fine. Okay, so that is going to take us through first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. I will point out there was one other article that was written in Dragon Magazine. This is actually for original Dungeons and Dragons. It was Dragon Magazine number 3, and I have talked about this before. It's a very, again, sort of an infamous article talking about notes on women and magic in Dungeons and Dragons by Len Lakofka. And it was, again, written in a time period where there weren't a lot of women players. And he was the gist of the article is that women characters can exist in the game just like male characters. And here's how you do it. And then he creates all these reasons for why they have to have different ability scores and different level limits and all this kind of stuff. But one of the things that they put in there is that it mentions that, female magic users are witches. So you'll want to see my video on that. That's Dragon Magazine issue number 3. I'll put a little link up here if you want to check that out. The article is very, very interesting, and they did get a lot of flack from people. I remember Lee Gold. If you're familiar with Lee Gold, she is the publisher of Alarms and Excursions, which is one of, if not the only, first D&D fanzine. It's not the only fanzine, but I think it was like the first one, or very, very close to being the first one, that's still being published today. And she wrote a pretty scathing kind of rebuttal to that article, which I think makes sense. But anyway, that's going to be it for kind of like original D&D and then also first edition Dungeons and Dragons as far as things published by TSR. Now let's get into the BECMI line of D&D. So just as a reminder, if you're new to the channel or you're new to D&D history and you don't know what I'm talking about here, there was a period of time that spanned from 1977 essentially until about 99 really, until Wizards of the Coast published third edition in 2000, where there were two concurrently published editions of Dungeons and Dragons. There was Advanced Dungeons and Dragons that went from 1977 through 1989, and then second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons that went from 89 through 99 or 2000 until the 2000 edition, third edition came out. But then starting in 1977, you also had the basic line. So I talked about you had, Holmes Basic published in 1977, and then that is changed in 1981. You have Mulvey Cook Marsh Basic Expert Dungeons and Dragons, or BX. And then in 1983, you have the Menser version of Dungeons and Dragons, which is commonly known as BECMI, Basic Expert Companion Masters and Immortals. That's eventually going to be all consolidated into a single book without the Immortals part in the Rules Cyclopedia. And then there's also, they had a few other like introductory sets. There was the Easy to Master version, or what people call the Black Box. And then there was the classic D&D set that was published later as an introduction to that. But those were all the same rule set. BECMI, Rules, Cyclopedia, Easy to Master, and Classic Dungeons & Dragons are all the same rule set. So they had a series of books published called the Gazetteers, and this was describing the campaign setting that became sort of the home campaign setting of this line of D&D, sort of like Greyhawk was the main campaign setting for first edition Dungeons and Dragons, at least when it was originally published. So most of those original modules, like the Village of Hamlet and the Slavers series, the A series, and like the C series of modules, the initial ones at least, the Giant series, the Drow series, all of those were assumed to take place in the world of Greyhawk. Well, the campaign setting for the BECMI line of D&D was originally called The Known World, created by Tom Mulvey and Lawrence Schick. And then over time, they had to give it a name for marketing purposes because they wanted something that they could trademark, and the known world is not something you could trademark. So they ended up calling it Mystra. But it's the same world, and it actually predates most of the other campaign settings that people are familiar with. So it goes all the way back to 1974, when Lawrence and Tom first discovered Dungeons and Dragons. It's not published by TSR until the release of the X1 Isle of Dread 1981, but they'd been working on it at that point for like about 7 years. Anyway, this is the Principalities of Glantri, which is one of the nations that is in the world of Mystra. And essentially what this is, it's a group of different nations within the principalities. They're all, principalities that are ruled by magic using characters. So they have all these like different houses of people that, of different cultures. And so there's like there's a vampire family. I know there's one of like werewolves, but like there's some groups of elves, and there's like two different groups of elves that don't get along. There's the vampire guy there. And there's a family that comes from, there's some Scottish like undead guys here, Prince MacGregor. But there's like a family that comes from module X2 Castle Amber. So they come from Earth and they ended up here, and they have magical abilities. So one of the kind of fun things that they put in this book is this idea of these schools of magic and how you can learn them. And there's 7 different schools. And so it goes through, so you have the School of Alchemy, you have Dracologists, you have Elementalists and Illusionists, Necromancers and Cryptomancers, and Witches. So the idea with these classes is that, so you would be a magic user, okay, but then what you would do is you spend experience points and you get extra abilities to belong to these like different, they call them circles, right? So you've got first circle, second circle. So you spend experience points to learn how to brew filters, it says, brews and filters, and then the Silver Tongue, which is the ability to speak very persuasively to NPCs and monsters who have to make a saving throw. And then there's a doll curse, which I love. So when a witch has a personal foe, she makes 2 dolls that look like her victim, and then she a process which takes 1 day per level of the victim, and then you hide the dolls in the victim's house, and every night thereafter, whenever the victim may be, the witch uses the other doll to affect. So it's very consistent with what you've seen before. It's called sympathetic magic, I believe. But you have doll of pain, doll of sickness, doll of insanity. So very, very kind of creative stuff there. You've got witch's charm. You've got spell binding. You've got witch's curse, shape change, and then the ultimate possession at 5th circle. So that's kind of like a way that witches were officially published as a character option. This is one of the first times we've seen that by TSR. Actually might be the first time where you could specifically play a witch in Dungeons and Dragons. So that's for player characters. And then also in this edition of the game, the Beckme line, in the Masters box set, so the M of Beckme, there is an explanation of non-human or non-demi-human spellcasters. So for clerics and for magic users. And it says that humanoid clerics are called shamans, and that humanoid magic users they use the term Wicca. So that's the term that sticks throughout Masters. And then that version of the class gets repeated in the rules cyclopedia, but by that point in time, they've changed the name from Wicca to Wokani is the plural, so Wokani. But it's otherwise, mechanically, it's the same as what they were talking about in the Master Set. So that's and they're very, very similar to witches, obviously. So that's kind of the Beckme line of D&D. But again, it's interesting in being the first time that I think that TSR published something allowing a player character to play a witch, which was this one right here. Okay. So that's the Beckme line. All right. And then we have one last version of D&D to talk about of the TSR era. And that is 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So there is no witch class in the player's handbook for 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, but there is a witch kit here in the Complete Wizard's Handbook. So as a reminder, I just did a whole video. It was very long, but it covered all 15 of the complete handbooks for 2nd edition. And so I didn't get to go into a lot of detail because, I was trying to get through all of the books in that time span. But there's a concept in 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons called a kit, which is, it's a background, it's an archetype, call it what you want, but it's basically a skin that you add on top of an existing class, so in this case, a wizard or magic user, and you get, it tells you like what non-weapon proficiencies, or nowadays you'd call them skills, that you would get either as a bonus or that you have to take if your weapon proficiencies change at all, and then what your special benefits and hindrances are. And so there is a wizard kit in here called a witch, and it's pretty long because it's almost like creating a new class. So a lot of the other kits, just to kind of give you a sense. So look here at the peasant wizard. It's not even a full page. I mean, it's close, but it's closer to like, maybe 2/3 of a page. Okay, or a little over. So that's the peasant wizard. The patrician's a little bit longer, but not much. But then you get to the witch, and it describes them. It's a wizard whose powerful magical abilities are extraplanar. So that's how they're going to present the witch in this particular case. Not nature so much, but like I said, extraplanar. So the wizards typically learn the basics of spell casting at magic academies or from learned mentors. Witches learn their magical skills from entities and their minions from other planes of existence or from other witches. So this is a little bit more in common with like some of the articles that we've seen before from Dragon, where it talked about where witches got their spells. Occasionally, these extraplanar entities contact youthful humans or demi-humans for magical instruction. Other times, humans and demi-humans seek them out. Okay. And then look how long this is. So full page here, going into the preferred schools that you can have. The most appropriate school for witches is enchantment and charm. Conjuration/summoning and necromancy are also good choices. And then bard schools, there's no bard schools that they're prevented from taking. If you're listening to this and not watching, that's bard, Barred. It's not bard, like they can't take bard spells. That's a different thing. Role that they play in the game. And then again, you've got your secondary skills, your weapon proficiencies, your non-weapon proficiencies, your equipment, Okay, and then your special benefits that you get. Okay, so this is going to be pretty lengthy. When a witch is initially created, she automatically gains the spells Detect Magic and Read Magic, in addition to any other spells that you normally receive. As you increase in level, you automatically gain the following abilities. So at 3rd, you gain Secure Familiar. At 5th, you gain Brew Calmative. At 7th, Brew Poison. At 9th, Beguile. 11th, Brew Flying Ointment. And then at 13th, Witch's Curse. And then there's a whole table here of the Witch's Curse. So you could reduce their ability scores by 3 points. You could reduce their 2-hit and damage rolls by 4 points. The victim becomes blind as per the 2nd level wizard spell Blind. These are all possibilities for a curse. And then it's going to go into the special hindrances. Oh, there's more curses here. So the victim loses 1 hit point per hour for the next 24 hours, or the victim immediately lapses into a state of temporal stasis, as per the 9th level wizard spell. And then your hindrances, because of their non-conventional training, they don't earn bonus to experience for high ability scores. They can't be multi-classed or dual-classed. Generally, outsiders are terrified of witches unless an NPC is exceptionally open-minded or has extremely high intelligence. The witch receives -3 reaction roll, which is very common in these types of kits, is to give mechanical bonuses like you see here, all these abilities. And then this is a mechanical bonus. It's a negative reaction roll, but it's really a role-playing thing. If your DM isn't using reaction rolls, then this hindrance is kind of pointless. So it requires the DM to make sure that you are, every time you're encountering an NPC, that there's a reaction roll being made to determine how open they are to talking to you, or if they're going to fight you automatically, or if they're going to befriend you. Okay, so I can tell you at the time we didn't play with these. It's not something I've really explored until I've started running the BX game for my daughter and her friends, where it is very important. But as kids, we never did that. So a hindrance like this really didn't mean anything. Okay, so it really explores that idea of what that means. And then you have to periodically struggle with extraplanar forces striving to direct you. Forces are so powerful that they cannot be dispelled. All the witch can do is endure them. So the frequency and intensity of the penalties is that you get a -2 penalty to attack rolls and saving throws on any night with a full moon, and 3 nights before and after the full moon. And then it talks about, how to determine if the moon's full. And then 25% chance per day that you'll be subjected to an internal struggle with extraplanar forces. You determine it at the beginning of the day. And then the witch struggles with extraplanar forces every night for a 12-hour period lasting from about 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., suffering a -1 penalty to its attack throws. There's no penalty to saving throw. So it kind of just depends on how that affects you. But very interesting, very detailed for a kit. Because again, the kits usually were just kind of like I said, a background or an archetype, and this one is almost developing a completely different class because of all the abilities that it gains. And again, it's very long. Okay, so that was the kit developed for the Complete Wizard's Handbook for 2nd edition. So again, an official TSR thing. Now, these were optional, of course, but it is a class, as was this, but optional to the standpoint of but you could play it as a player character. It's not designed just for NPCs. Now, one other thing that's going to come out for 2nd edition, and this is very late in the timeline here. So this is the Van Richten's Complete Monsters Compendium, I think it's called. So specifically volume 3, but this was a 3-volume set, and the first 2 volumes and parts of volume 3 were compiling stuff that had come out previously in these Van Richten's guides that were designed for Ravenloft, the Ravenloft campaign setting. But volume 3 does have some new rules in it, some things that you hadn't seen before. And in the book, this is written by Steve Miller, who is a game designer and artist, who claimed that he prefers, his favorite game designer is Dave Arneson. He loves the Blackmoor setting. And he worked on a lot of D20 stuff, including Star Wars and other D20 games. He worked on the Saga system. He worked on Traveler. He wrote articles for Dragon Magazine. And of course, thematically appropriate, is known for the song Abracadabra, which was a joke because it's a different Steve Miller. But I thought, it's funny, Abracadabra, witches. But in any event, in Volume 3, he writes a witch and warlock kit for spellcasters, and it's very different than the witch kit that you see here in the Wizard's book, and most specifically because I thought this is a very interesting choice. It's a kit that's only available to non-spellcasting characters. So it says that you can take the witch or warlock kit as a fighter or a thief. You can't take it if you're a cleric, paladin, ranger, bard, or wizard, because those are all spellcasting classes, or druid. So I thought that was very interesting. It's a very different kind of approach. So it talks about how witches are basically non-chaotic and warlocks are non-lawful. And you can be an elf or a half elf, or you can be human, or you can be Vistani or half Vistani, which are sort of, if you're not familiar with Ravenloft, that's their version of a culture similar to like the Romani here on, historical Earth, or, even modern day Earth. But they created this thing called the Vistani. And now witches have spells that are more akin to priest spells, what they call priests, or, be clerics in second edition. And warlocks have spells that are more consistent with like wizard type spells. And you gain spells by doubling the XP requirements for the class that you are. So if you're a thief or a fighter and you take this kit, in order to advance to second level in those classes, you have to double the XP that you would normally have. And the trade-off of that is that you get to cast these spells. They have very specific spells that they cast. They cast them very differently. So they're not just casting priest spells or wizard spells like a wizard or a priest would do. They have a different way of casting them. Their spell progression is very, very slow. So they don't gain like the top level spells until very, very high level. So, it's not a standard spell casting progression for either of these. And then it even has some ideas on how you could approach it, where maybe you were already a fighter or a thief, and then later on you decided that you wanted to be a witch or a warlock. And it tells you how you essentially at that point almost become like a multi-class character in order to get those abilities. So very, very different approach. Again, like I said, very different from what you saw in the Wizard's Handbook for second edition. But again, an official TSR release explaining how, as a player character, you could play a witch type character. All right, so that's second edition. And now what we're going to go to next is, again, like I said, it's going to be very, very brief, but we are going to visit how witches have appeared in, let's say, third, fourth, and fifth edition of Dungeons and Dragons very quickly. And then we're going to wrap up talking about some third-party things going all the way back, like I said, to the 70s that were written with witches in mind, as far as like being player characters, and things that were compatible with Dungeons and Dragons or advanced Dungeons and Dragons, even if those companies didn't necessarily have the license at the time to say that. Now, witches don't appear in third edition, but in the Dungeon Master's Guide for third, and this is repeated in the Dungeon Master's Guide for 3.5 as well, almost word for word. But there's a section on how to kind of like create variant classes and things like that. And it's specifically talking about spell lists for variant spellcasters. And it gives an example here of the witch. And it says, here's an example of creating a new spell list for a variant spellcasting class, the witch. A staple fantasy literature and fairy tales, the witch dabbles in many kinds of magic, minor illusions, spells dealing with health or life, nature-based magic, simple divinations, and spells that alter the shape and appearance of things, but excels at just a few. So here's a list, somewhat limited, but contains wizard, cleric, and druid spells, uses the sorcerer's spells per day, and the spells are based on charisma, your charisma ability. And then the spells is designed with these considerations in mind. So they get cure spells, illusions, divinations, charms, form-changing, nature, flashy spells, and miscellaneous. And then here's the list. So it's, again, talking about, just the gist of this thing is telling you as a dungeon master how you can create new spellcasting classes without necessarily creating a new class, simply by changing the spell list. So that's third and 3.5. In fourth edition, you don't really have witches either. What you have is a class in here that is called a warlock. So this is the first time that the warlock's going to be in like a core book. So warlocks debuted before this, in the tail part of 3.5, I think it was. but this is a class, like a core class that appears in here. And again, I've mentioned how a lot of times people use the terms witch and warlock kind of to mean the same thing, except that, witches are female and warlocks are male. That's not how it's used here, but there's some stuff in this, the way that this class is written up, that kind of reminds you of a witch, specifically if you take the Pact of the Fae Pact. That would be probably your closest way of kind of creating a witch in this edition. Later on in 4th edition, there's going to be a book called, check my notes here because I don't have this. It's a player's option, Heroes of the Feywild. And in there's a witch subclass of wizard, and they get some different abilities. They get a familiar, they get an augury ability, and they can join something called the Moon Coven, which is mostly for flavor, but it gives them like some different kinds of things for witches. So that's the witch for 4th edition Pact of the Feywild. Now, as far as 5th edition, to my knowledge, and again, I'm not well versed on 5th edition because I don't really play it. I played it a couple times, but I don't run it right now currently. But I don't believe that there's an official witch class for 5th edition. But I think, from what I understand, I kind of looked this up, on D&D Beyond and things like that. You can find all kinds of like fan created witch, whether it's a background or a subclass or whatever it is. An archetype, I don't know, but like all that kind of stuff that fans have created for witches. So, but again, to my knowledge, I don't think there's been an official one written by Wizards of the Coast for 5th edition. Okay, so again, I told you it was going to be brief. That's sort of our look at the witches in post-TSR era D&D, because, the focus of my channel really is on history and on the TSR era, but I thought people might be interested in that. Now, what I do want to talk about next is cover some of the other companies, third-party companies that were publishing things that were intended to be compatible with Dungeons and Dragons that had witches in them. Okay, so before I get to that, if you are looking to try to thank me or help the channel, support the channel, again, the reminder, the 2 best ways you can do right now are by becoming a super fan. So hit that little heart icon with the $ in it that you see underneath your video there in the nav bar. And if you're able to and can contribute to that, you can join all these other fine folks who have done the same. And I really appreciate it. So I just recently got a microphone that I'm trying to use, and people have told me that the sound was better. Some folks said that they didn't notice any difference at all, but there were a few folks that said they definitely noticed an improvement in sound using my microphone. So I'm going to do that moving on, and contributions like that help. And then secondly, you can buy something from my shop, including this new design that I just created in honor of the 50th anniversary of Dungeons and Dragons. It's an homage to the classic white box. So you can get on a t-shirt, hoodie, mug, poster, notebook, etc. But I have a bunch of other designs as well. And all of that is in the show notes below. All right, so let's look at these third-party companies. Well, going kind of back, not quite to the beginning, but very, very close. There was a magazine called The Dungeoneer that was started, I believe, by Janelle Jakeways. And she had a class in like issue number 2 called the Circean, I think, like after Circe, right? And it's very much in line with like a witch type class, even though it wasn't called a witch. But then in Judges Guild Journal, issue number 7, you do get a witch class. Specifically, it's called Witchcraft in D&D. And it is it's based on the psionics system, interestingly enough, from Supplement 3 Eldritch Wizardry, which had come out in 1976. And so this, that journal, number 7, I think also comes out in later 1976. So they were capitalizing on that system to create this new witch class for D&D. Now, I unfortunately don't have copies of either of those. Most of these I don't have copies of, or at least physically. But then as time goes on, the Dungeoneer and Judges Guild's Journal continue to publish variations of witch type classes over time, over the next few years. Okay, and then in 1983, you have the Complete Spellcaster published by Bard Games. Now, we've talked briefly about Bard Games before, so I have a physical copy of their Complete Alchemist. But they came out with, I think it was 3 books. So it's Complete Alchemist. There was the Complete Adventurer, which had a bunch of different classes like bandits and bounty hunters and things like that in it. And then they had the Complete Spellcaster that had a bunch of variant spellcasting classes, one of which was the Witch. And It's very druid-like. It's very druid-like. You can see the layout here, or almost lack of. I mean, it's in columns, but like it's very utilitarian. And this was intended to be compatible with Advanced Dungeons and Dragons without saying that. So it was sort of like a wink and a nod, and kind of like you knew that that's what it was for. I believe it says it's for fantasy adventure games, but reading between the lines, it's presented so that it could very easily be used with Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So that's Bard Games from 1983. Then you have Mayfair Games, 1990. So this is kind of an interesting one. Mayfair Games has a really interesting history because they were publishing other types of games first, and then they decided to get into role playing. And they had, I don't know if he was on staff or he was just connected to them, a gentleman who had a legal background, legal training. And he said that, he read all the legal things that he needed to read to say that they could use the names Advanced Dungeons and Dragons as long as they didn't claim that they owned the trademark. And so you see here in the corner of this book, published in 1990, this is Witches. This is their Roll Aids line of Mayfair Games, and Roll Aids was specifically designed to be compatible with Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And so they say it's compatible or for use with, but then it clearly states that they don't own the trademark. It's a trademark owned by TSR. It's not owned by them. And, they're using it, without asking, like this kind of thing. But those are all things that apparently protected them legally from getting in trouble. However, just as a side note, Gary Gygax actually wanted to create a licensing agreement with Mayfair and Roll Aids, according to him, and he got shot down by the board. So they did have a license agreement at one point with Games Workshop. They also had one with Judges Guild. And so he wanted to do one with Mayfair Games, and according to him, he was not allowed to pursue that any further. But some type of agreement was made. However, in 1993, TSR is going to sue Mayfair Games for breaking whatever that agreement was that they had, the way that Mayfair and Roll Aids was using this, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons terms. And what was found in the courts was that the entirety of them doing that didn't break it, but there were specific instances where they had broken that agreement. So later on, Mayfair is actually going to be acquired by TSR and get all their assets. And unfortunately, they've never republished any of the stuff, even though TSR owned those. So since it was acquired by TSR or purchased by them, and then Wizards of the Coast acquired TSR, I think that should mean by the transitive property of whatever that means, ownership, that Wizards of the Coast should have the ability to republish some of those old Roll Aids supplements, at least in PDF form, or in POD, but we've not seen that. So in any case, this is the 1990 release of Witches by Mayfair Games. And very interestingly, you just see they have a whole bunch of different types of wizards, different traditions. There's a classical one, and there's one that they call Dianic that was for very specific for medieval witches. There's a fae or fairy witches. There's an animistic witch. And then they actually had an agreement to, I think they had an agreement to use some fictional sources from the work of Catherine Kurtz and her books on, I think it's pronounced Darini. I have no idea how to pronounce that. But there's that tradition that's presented of like a fictional source of witches. So that is a third party from 1990. There's also, you have an article from White Dwarf. This was from 1985, I believe that it was. And this is an article on it's hags, but it's written to present them as a player character class. And it's very, very difficult to read. I know that. Unfortunately, it's just a very bad copy of this. But again, the White Dwarf coming out of Games Workshop in England. And before it became a house organ for just all the Games Workshop stuff, they used to produce material for other games. And so this article was very specific to creating a hag type character for a Dungeons and Dragons game. So you had all these third parties that were producing stuff like that. Now, as you get into like later eras, witches are just a very popular character class. So you have things like Green Ronin's masterclass series of books, like the Witch's Handbook, which has, it presents a whole new class, very specific for third edition. And, new spells and feats and all that all the stuff that you would get from third edition. And then Mongoose Publishing, not to be left out, they also created the Quintessential Witch. You can see this was done very specifically to emulate these old complete handbooks from second edition because these were so popular. So they tried to kind of emulate the trade dress and design for their quintessential line. You might recall from an earlier video, I actually wrote one of the quintessential books for Mongoose. And so this again presents a whole character class and then a bunch of different options and stuff for witch type characters in a third edition game. So I'm a sucker for classes, especially in third edition era. I thought they were all cool and I wanted to see all the new feats and skills and all the stuff. So I bought a lot of those from various companies. And then Pathfinder, Advanced Player's Guide. So in here they have a witch class from it's like a variation, like a new class that they created. So there's a bunch of new classes in here, and I just wanted to kind of show you a quick look at that and the art. So this is how they depict. So see, now this is going much more closely to like the nature type, like more almost like a druid. But they have different abilities, and it's basically almost like a combination druid wizard, but not, or druid sorcerer, not quite, but and then they get different abilities as well. So that was, again, I told you, a very brief look at sort of like third parties that have been developing content about witches for Dungeons and Dragons. Now, these ones, of course, can be published under the D20, the open game license, as well as Pathfinder. But some of those early ones, like the Bard game ones, that's why they very specifically avoid the use of naming Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and they present everything differently. Rolaids really skirts the line, and apparently they got away with it for a while due to some kind of agreement that they had. But that's going to wrap up this look at the history of witches in Dungeons and Dragons. I really hope that you enjoyed this. And then Richard, the person that suggested the topic, I hope you liked it and you got what you wanted out of this. If you want to see more detail in any one of these, please drop a note in the comments below and let me know. And also just let me know like what you thought of the video. And always feel free to suggest topics that I can cover. And, I keep a list. I keep an ongoing list. I tend to want to cover things that like specifically if I actually own the product so I can show it as opposed to just showing a PDF. And also I prefer showing things or talking about things that I've actually played and used. But that being said, again, leave those ideas in the comments below and let me know what you think. Let me know if you played any of these witch variants over the years, or like which one and how did it work? And did you use it as an NPC or did you use it as a player character? And, was this too powerful as it tries to claim in here or not? Let me know that. And also while you're down below leaving your comments, make sure to check out the show notes for places where you can join me on social media, links to my blog. And again, there's going to be links to my shop down there as well. And that's going to wrap this up. So thank you so very much for watching. Stay safe, happy gaming, and I will talk to you next time. And now for the bonus content. What I was drinking and listening to as I was thinking about making my notes for this particular video. So I'm going to scooch this to the side just for a second because I don't want to spill on it. But I know this probably looks like, I don't know, moonshine or something, but I gave these out as Christmas gifts to my family a few years ago. So this is a Finocchietto, and it's essentially like limoncello, except instead of lemons for the flavoring, I use wild fennel. So it's a wild fennel liqueur. I realize fennel can be kind of polarizing. It's got that kind of anise or licorice flavor that a lot of people don't like, but I personally love it. So it mainly uses the fronds from that, but there was also pieces of fennel, and you make it again very similar to limoncello. So it's just like a high proof neutral grain spirit. So I used like 100 proof vodka. That was the highest proof that I could find, and then and you steep the produce or whatever flavor that you're going to use. In this particular case, obviously it was fennel. And then later on, you're going to add some sugar and things like that and make a liqueur out of it. So, like I said, I gave this out to my family as Christmas gifts a few years ago. So, I made 3. I made this, I made a nocino, which is like a walnut liqueur. And then I made, a basil version of this with using basil instead of, like lemons or fennel. So, And I think that in particular this one and the basil one are great in cocktails, using it in place of a liqueur that you would normally use, especially when mixed with gin. I think that they can, depending on the kind of gin you pick. So I chilled this down a little bit in my fridge, and that's how I prefer to drink it. It's just kind of a little sipper, like this neat, chilled after dinner, and it's kind of a fun palate cleanser. So cheers, chin chin, all those things. Mm, yeah, you can really smell. Like as soon as I open the jar, you can smell that. You can smell the fennel, but obviously you can taste it on the palate as well. So I'll put a recipe for how to make this down below in the show notes if anybody is interested in that. Lid on here. Okay, so then keeping with the kind of, it's Halloweenish time. It's October 7th today. Keeping with that theme, I pulled this record. I haven't listened to this for years. So I got this. This is the Skeleton Dance, part of the Silly Symphonies collection from Walt Disney. So I got this years ago. It was a record store day release, and it's just two songs. It's this on the front side, which is why I picked it for the skeleton imagery, and then three little pigs on the back. But Skeleton Dance was the first silly symphony that was produced by Walt Disney back in 1929, and the music is traditionally, I guess this says March of the Dwarfs. I've also seen it called March of the Trolls, but it's by Edvard Grieg, who's a Norwegian Romantic era composer, and then reinterpreted by Carl Stalling, who arranged it. So Carl Stalling, everybody would know who that is if you've ever seen. I mean, a lot of the silly symphonies, of course, but also pretty much any of the early Warner Brothers cartoons, especially the ones that relied on using classical music cues. That's Carl Stalling. So I have like a couple of CD collections of his musical cues from Warner Brothers animated features and shorts. And for this year's Record Store Day Black Friday event, so I think it's November 29th. It's whatever the Friday is after Thanksgiving, which I think is November 29th this year, 2024. There is a special release of the Carl Stalling musical cues from Warner Brothers on vinyl. So like I said, I have it on CD. So be sure to look for that if that's something that you're interested in. Check your local record shop, see if they're going to get it in. And unfortunately for Record Store Day releases, they usually the store can't hold it for you. You have to show up and wait in line and get it. But I wouldn't think too many people would be after that. So if your shop has a few, you might be lucky with that. But this is really it's just fun. It's goofy. It's not something I pull out and listen to all the time, but obviously I think it is probably better. It's more fun to watch. The animation for this is a lot of fun. The dance, it's kind of like, I've heard it described as sort of like an animated version of like a medieval dance macabre and imagery of, skeletons in a graveyard kind of celebrating. And it's really fun. So I highly recommend, seeing if you can find this, or just look the video up on YouTube. You can find it. I think you should be able to find it anywhere. And that's going to be it for now. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and let me know what you think in the comments below. And until next time, take care, and I'll talk to you next time.